question for Sarah.
Juste après la chute du mur et l'effondrement de l'Union soviétique, et donc vous avez aperçu
You went
les
just after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Et tout ça. Et je me posais la question par rapport aux vagues migratoires à Moscou.
My question's about the migration.
Il y a énormément d'échanges avec d'autres pays comme l'Angola, le Cuba et tous les pays qui étaient alignés sur le bloc soviétique. Et suite à cet effondrement, quelles ont été les grandes vagues migratoires de...
So my question is, what were the big migration waves after the fall of the Soviet Union? Thank you for your question.
Quand je suis arrivée en 1991, il se trouve que le 9e microrayon de Turkestan est tout près de l'UDN de l'Université de l'Amitié des Peuples Patrice Lumumba. Et donc là, il y avait énormément de migrants.
In 1991, when I arrived, there was a lot of African migration and South African migration after the movement of Patrice Lumumba from Congo.
Très isolé, en fait. L'université était un peu en vase clos.
The university was enclosed with the community of residents staying in their environment. And therefore, not many Russian students would go.
There were a few mixed marriages. And in the last 5 or 6 years, there have been research programs on what happened in these stories with the return to the respective countries of different people, the people who've gone through this experience. This migration was immediately replaced by internal migration in the former USSR. For economic reasons, people came to Moscow to look for work from Central Asia, from Ukraine, from pretty much everywhere, from the Caucasus. In the 1990s, there were a lot of armed conflicts in the republics, not to mention Chechnya. So you found a lot of political refugees in Moscow, and then very complicated situations where the Soviet state made a distinction between nationality and citizenship. You're a Soviet citizen, but of Russian nationality or Jewish or Ukrainian or whatever you like. And so there were a lot of people who found themselves without legal papers, citizens without rights in the Russian Federation, because their parents might have lived in some place in Siberia or in East Germany, or the first child was born there. So people were in extraordinary situations. So Tali, different things, trying to get papers in Russia, getting a residence permit. People queued all night. It was part of the queuing was a kind of a job, an informal people would queue for others. That was a new kind of business in order to get papers in particular. There was a whole circuit. You had to prove that you didn't have chlamydia or syphilis or whatever. So you had to go to the anti-tuberculosis clinic and then psychiatric asylums. Each time you had to go back to the savings bank to pay your tax. So in fact, to go back to Emmanuel Tai's analysis, a kind of work that could not be relocated, particularly construction, particularly the new districts in the city of Moscow, which was a huge project and pretty much stopped in 2008 with the financial crisis. So it's half finished and half a wasteland. And today, with the new wave, is Russia affected? At present, with the sanctions and the fall in oil prices, things are pretty bad in Russia, but rather better than, for example, Kurdistan. Are there refugees, Syrian refugees who go to Russia? No, not as far as I know. That crisis in the Middle East has not affected Russia. Although I don't really know, to be honest. I have a question for everybody, for all the speakers, but particularly those who spoke about the post-socialist city, which relates to the inhabitants of these districts, these micro-rayons and so on. You presented the areas in question without really relating them to the city centres where you were talking about, the centres of those cities. So I was very interested by a reflection that Sarah started with when that Sarah talked about the beginning. And I was thinking, in fact, and that's why I say that it's for the speakers who talked about the post-communist city. I was thinking about the inhabitants of these districts. They form a kind of political category. So they need to be treated as a political category. In the period 89-91 period, depending on the country, given that there are countries such as former East Germany, where the bigger states are not much desired and considered kind of where people still want to go. So I wanted to know if you could tell me a little bit about the way in which these people relate to the centres that were at one point desired and are now somewhat abandoned, perhaps. Okay. For the case of Moscow, you must remember that there were different statuses. The inhabitants had different statuses. In particular, for example, cooperative buildings were extremely high prestige and socially approved. So it's not what we call areas of exclusion. They were not sub-citizens. So the question I'm asking is what the view is now. In Moscow, it varies a lot. You can't really make a general reply, give a general answer, because, for example, I mentioned it, the west of the city is very chic, and the east was industrial. That's where there's the most industrial wastelands, the brownfields zones. People are much poorer. So, yeah, there's been a movement. At the beginning, there's what was called the New Russians. People worked on their own houses, home improvements. But then there were subsequently movements greater movements towards segregation with new buildings, luxury buildings, closed, gated communities,
I don't remember if I mentioned it or not, but Kudani, this part of Tbilisi that I was speaking about, is sometimes in a half-serious way is referred as a separate city, partially because the population of it is, as I said, bigger than the second biggest city in Georgia. It's more than 150,000 people. Another thing is that it is, in terms of mobility and connectivity, it is quite isolated from the rest of the city. While this was not a big problem before end of the Soviet Union, because partially most of the people were employed close to where they were living in the factories, maybe 2-3 kilometers away from their house, and they were connected with metro. After the dissolution of Soviet Union, most of these factories have been closed down, and the employment for those who were able to find somewhere in the city, let's say the point where they need to commute, travel changed. Also I mentioned that this project is like half, not complete, let's say so. And while this district was developed, there was a plan that the metro in Tbilisi would develop to a certain extent that it would cover the whole district, like up until the end. Now there is only one station at the beginning of the mass housing district, and from that point until the end there is like around 3 kilometers. And at night and also in the evening it's not very well connected anymore. So for the people who live at the edge of the district, they feel a real gap with the rest of the city. It takes bigger effort for them to connect. So yeah, they still feel kind of dependent on the city because this is a place where they need to go to do something, to work, to, I don't know, have fun. So
I think it's beyond the notion of dependency. It's the idea, do they feel as citizens of the same city, or do they feel like a second zone?
In the talks with them and also in one of the documentaries that was produced about these neighborhoods, some people say that we still feel as a separate, let's say, entity. This is said partially, it's not like a fully serious statement, but there is some truth in it when they're saying it. And sometimes it's said in a bit, with a bit of pride as well, because so there is such a gap between this part of the city as it is on the fringe and the rest, that they feel that, I don't know, it's a separate place. And yeah, we feel dependent, but also we're a bit separate, yeah.
For Poland, there's no real problem of being separate because the beginning of construction, it was on the periphery of the city, but now it's considered the center of the city. There's 10 minutes by tram to the old city. There's just the river between the district and the old city. So the inhabitants feel entirely part of the city. They feel entirely in the center of Poznan. And as I said in my presentation in 2008, when there was the economic crisis, it was the apartments in Zarataya which rose in price. These apartments are very, very much in demand, and the inhabitants are very happy to live there. And it's in no way pejorative to live in these estates, because in the presentation, when people use the word estate, it doesn't really explain the ambience in that district. And to finish, the city understands very well that the district is in the center. And I also said that there was a plan for a new bridge which will further attach the district to the city center. So a microphone? I want to ask a question to all the speakers. Today, this afternoon, all the presentations concentrate on the history of the context, the spatial context, historical context, cultural context, and then at the end, did we see photos of the transformations, either of the apartments themselves or the outside in Corviale. So I wanted to ask this emphasis on the historical context raised the theme of polarity projected into, for example, the context of Kara. It's very interesting. I wanted to ask you the question, how does your emphasis on the context can help us to interpret the heart of our colloquium, the key, the center of our colloquium, the essence of our colloquium? I'm not very happy with appropriation. I saw when we were discussing yesterday. What is the proper part of appropriation? How do we interpret this transformation that you showed us at the end of your presentations? How, and that's a question, a broader question to do with comparison. How can the social, cultural and spatial context help to interpret the transformations that you showed with the photos? I can try and begin with an answer. I think that in the case of Corviale, I'll start. Why start with history? And even as what I asked you to give us sort of formatted sheets on the current history of the buildings. What is interesting, and going back to the case of Corviale, is the fact that if we look at the building just like that, in fact you have first of all a kind of exotic effect. You can see, as people said yesterday, you can see recovered materials, found materials that can be found both in informal or illegal settlements, a kind of aesthetic of DIY, of self-build. And finally, behind that, for me, the error would be to see this as a form of fatality. And the further back we go in history, social and political history in each country, we find something that is even more interesting, from my point of view, perhaps as an anthropologist, which is the context of between spaces, which are not spatial in between spaces, but between spaces of transition, a time when control is released, or when there's a political transition, or economic transitions. Economic transitions in each country. That's obviously the case of the former Soviet countries, where you have access to private ownership and then to business, a certain type of activity, which as a result influences the physical transformation of space. And the physical transformation, you see, becomes an indication, a clue which explains what's behind. And from my point of view, what is the very, very interesting thing in Italy is that we're in a context where there has been a debate on private ownership. I don't know about other countries, but at a given moment, there was a discussion about making them privately available. And it was set aside for land reasons at a certain point. The idea of saying that we have a public legacy, a public patrimony, and there's a parallel management, it nevertheless remains a public asset. We never know what's going to happen in the future. So we will keep this public asset, and we'll accept this total hybrid between self-organization, between residents and the presence of the state. So for me, the fact of asking questions about the social and economic structure, and therefore the history, that brings us to have that situation. It is the context that requires us to go back to these historical explanations. It's necessary in order to understand how we have got to this point. And I would add that in fact, I'm a bit short of time, but so I didn't have time to explain. The interesting question is to wonder not only about public ownership, but there was no vote in favor of rehabilitation. The rehabilitation voted for was never done in 2005. When the decision was made to have a competition, we're playing on the question of the representation of space. It's a space that is so stigmatized, which is extremely complicated to manage, precisely because it's a kind of synthesis of Italian history on the question of public and private housing, collective management and self-management. So we end up playing on another level, which is the level of representation. So we're going to have a competition now, competition of ideas. What hasn't been specified in this competition of ideas is to know, as an anthropologist, for me, the participation in the competition was a study case. What do they do with these inhabitants initiatives. The choice is that the fourth floor, which was supposed to be a service space, which was taken over by the inhabitants, it's been decided to accept that it will also be a residential space. So the idea is accepted that it will remain a housing space. It is accepted. It's translated into a program, but we start from scratch. So the requirement of standardization from the state is coming. So even if we try to follow the intuition of the inhabitants, even if we decide that we don't care about the free floor, we forget about the local shops because we've now got a big supermarket, and we're never going to fill a whole kilometer with small shops and small workshops because the society has changed so much since the 1960s. The result is, and what's more, the inhabitants have moved onto the ground floor certain activities that were supposed to take place on the fourth floor. So it's now accepted that it becomes housing, but it starts from scratch. Everything's going to be destroyed and rebuilt. And now we're in a dimension where we follow the inhabitants, but only up to a certain point. There are people who've invested up to 60,000 euros in those houses, and now they're going to lose the lot.
I try to answer this based on my project on the white buildings. Because as the white building is kind of the form, using about the form that record all the layers step on each other, and each layer represent one thing. It can be represent the history, and the other layer it can be represent the political movement, society, culture, and those layers is kind of kind of on top of each other on the white building. And so how can we depict those layers? And this is kind of my question that I study about the white building from the beginnings. And the white building is not happen only just just alone. It has to be interact with another society, the history, the war, civil war, culture, art, and even the development around of the city nowadays. Why the people close the ground floor to have restaurant, coffee shop? Because of the development around the white building that set the building, into kind of create this kind of activity. And why art community choose the white building as the destination for the office? Because we have a story of demolitions. We have the old artists that used to live and now living inside the white buildings. So all this movement, social movement, history, and everything is kind of record as a layer with the white building and kind of set the white building as it you can see now. So as to your question, I can say that it's very potential that in order to look, to the currently or to the future, we should look to the layer for the past. What the past give the notion to the present, to the future, and because everything how to connect to each other, how to connect to the context and the past, and this is how the past story and the current situation that set the white building until now. You can see people build up their home. Why? Because of lack of space for living. Because because of their culture, community culture, if extended family. So even the children and the doctor, they married, they still live with their parents. So they need space. That's why they build up the masonry. And this kind of everything kind of very interconnect to each other, and this is kind of very important that we have to study like every corner. It's not only the history, but every corner of the form or the things. Maybe I can answer you a little bit.
I find that the political and historical context is very important. I was born in 1984, and I don't remember communism. Before I can understand this historic context myself and the way people live and the birth of this district, I couldn't interpret the transformations if I didn't understand that, or lack of transformation in Poland, because it's one of the cleanest districts in Poland. I interpret that Poles always have a kind of fear of doing something different. They don't want to draw attention, they don't want people to ask questions. I think they prefer to remain inside their apartments, do what they want within their apartments, because that's their home, but outside they want to remain neutral so that nobody can see what's going on. And I'm personally persuaded that this comes from the communist era, the psychosis of communism that existed during that period.
I think looking at the context, in some cases gives you the answer why certain phenomena unfolded that way. For example, in case of Georgia and also South Caucasus, two other post-Soviet states, there was this like a huge wave of privatization that happened in just like 1 year, more or less. And if you look at all these three countries, in all three countries' political context at that time, which was state, like central government as well as local, in deep crisis, not able to deal with anything happening around, managed to somehow give incentive to the society in a way to take something from the situation. I think that was one thing that, like later when I started to think what was the reason. Another thing, for example, in case of Georgia and also maybe several other cases, when we look at the extensions of these residential buildings, like we can ask questions, why didn't these people move? And why did they extend their apartment? Sometimes there is an answer that maybe this society prefers to improve their residential environment in place instead of relying on residential mobility, or maybe in the case of certain neighborhoods, most of the neighborhood cannot afford to move to other place in the city because it's not available to them. So they invest in like, let's say, improvements in the place. And if you look at like the context and look at the context, can maybe give you this kind of answers. I don't know.
Merci.
Thank you. I'll answer the question of the method. The use of history. When you arrive for the first time in a place like Bulgaria, the first thing that strikes you is why have they done that blue, green, red, closed, open? It's a sort of patchwork. Why is it like that? The problem is that this first field analysis, it raises hypotheses, and then you have to verify your hypotheses. The first solution is to go and talk to people and ask them questions. But the inhabitants only talk in terms of memory. And as we know that even after 50 years of communism and one generation after, memory is very ambiguous, particularly in the eastern countries, how people experience communism, how they perceive, how their children perceive it. So if you base yourself entirely on an analysis of the space as it is and ignore the memory of the inhabitants, you miss something. And in the case of my thesis, I had to look at the history, firstly to understand why the inhabitants appropriate things in this way, and also to verify hypotheses formed in the field. And finally, I think it's history, it's what people tell you that enables you to verify these hypotheses. Why do the inhabitants appropriate things in Bulgaria? Why flower gardens and not vegetable gardens? And history teaches us is that Bulgaria has always been essentially an agricultural place until the mid-20th century. So there's a permanence of peasant traditions and Turkish traditions, which is huge. And therefore, despite 50 years of communism that attempted to erase all that, continues to appear through the cracks, and since 1991 has returned in space. So history is a kind of way of validating what you see in the field. It helps you to go back and forth between what you see in the field, what history tells you, and how these two things interact. Okay. No, I didn't take a historical approach, as you may have noticed. But I'm still going to have a slightly different kind of response. I agree with Anita that I just couldn't give a damn whether the facade is green or blue. What interests me is the object, is the context itself, including its historic profundity, its historical depth. The second thing for the case of Moscow, and to go back on what was said before, Moscow has always been a city of phantasm with some ridiculous plans, and has always been self-built because the public authorities were always overtaken by events. So the intrinsic quality of Moscow is to be a kind of DIY place, despite its apparent modernity, which can almost seem brutal at first sight. There's something else I wanted to say. I think that the anthropologist's answer is that human beings are historical beings, are temporal beings, and it's very important to be able to project oneself into the future. And I'm thinking of the work by Colette Pétonnet. If you want to think about this type of form, I think what she showed very clearly is that in the transition from the slum to the transitional city, there's not just a loss of a social fabric, but also the impossibility to project oneself into a future existence, this transitional situation. And since you're asking the question of appropriation, I think that the homogenization, it's as if singularization was a necessary condition of appropriation. But Moscow, when I knew it, was uniform. And in fact, one of the qualities of this type of building is that you're immediately familiar. Where everything is the same, where everything looks the same, the decoration is the same. When you need to go to the toilet and you're visiting somebody for the first time, you don't even ask how to get there. You just ask them if you can go and use the toilet. So I think appropriation should not be opposed to singularization. I may have forgotten something, but that'll do.
Bonjour.
Hello. What can you tell us about the subjects of pride and the way that people have used participation as a kind of tool of urban... what can you say about identity? Identity, proud, the sense of belonging that people who have done or to their own building in these places. Pride and identity. Corviale, it's a bit difficult. It depends because people are different. You can't generalize. I can't really give a general answer to your question. Some people are proud, some people perhaps aren't proud. What we saw, particularly in Corviale, is that the tenants of Corviale are, above all, inhabitants who came in 1982 when the first, those are the ones who developed this committee, and of course they're proud. They wanted to live in their homes, and as a result they became activists, which shows a certain pride, a certain desire to make their own homes. And then there's a whole new generation, the second generation, which is somewhat the generation which experienced the stigmatization of the building, which perhaps has a different relation to the building of Corviale. See it as a kind of, not a slum, but something like that. And it's a period where we met inhabitants. There was the arrival of drug trafficking. I think they've experienced something very different from their parents, and therefore perhaps they had a way of expressing themselves and a kind of a revolt and a rebellion. But it's also a period of personal life which can, I think there are people who hated the building. So what can I say about that? What else can I say? Are people proud of living in Corviale? They live there. That's all. They make their lives. Some of them have vegetable gardens. They're very proud, frankly. In the appropriation, there's a certain factor of doing what you want to do. We couldn't visit, for example, the collective rooms of tenants because it's a bit complicated. But there are people who are really committed to the renovation of their apartments, and they spent quite a bit of money. And I imagine that they're proud of what they've done. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made the investment. Okay. I haven't really understood. If you want an answer in relation to what they've done, we go back to what Ferdinand Delier was saying about Zen. We are in conditions which we didn't emphasize enough, because this is a place which is hyper-stigmatized. They're not part of the urban fabric, as we saw, for example, with the White Building, which is accessible. You don't see a kind of fracture, or there's no impossibility of entering. This is a kind of symbolic frontier. You don't just visit Corviale like that on a whim. You have to choose to go there. So as a result, I think we're really in a dimension of, in quotation marks, the effort that the people have made. It reflects the fact that they have a real hold on their own space. And there is no rehabilitation which is going to allow them to be, which is going to let the state, allow the state to come in and change everything. When I talked about internal conflicts, you have representations of what it means to live in Corviale, which are very, very different. You have contrasting views. There are levels of legitimacy in being there which are very, very different. There are narratives of construction which are very different from one inhabitant to another. Everybody has their own reason to be there. Everybody has their own story. And on the other hand, it's true, the shared condition is not appropriation. The condition is that they live in the same space every day. That's what they share. It's not that they have worked much on where they live, but the conflict between... We said there are a lot of family links within the building, and is that what's driven people to occupy the fourth floor? It's something that was not designed for social housing. The idea that you were going to remain within your family nucleus. The idea is you go in, you're never going to have children, you're never going to get married. and that your socioeconomic conditions are always going to stay the same. So you have a kind of contrast between what the inhabitants produce, which is a real critique of the project of social housing. I show the limitations of this project. That is, putting people in boxes like this, and imagine that a family is not going to evolve. The family evolves, there's space available, I will occupy that space, and in that way I produce a habitat. That capacity is a product of a situation of extreme pride on the one hand and preoccupation on the other hand, because what we see is a kind of form of informal housing which will therefore disturb some of the what you call the legitimate inhabitants.
I think it's the way the word like proud, I think it's related a little bit to desire of people. Because, I mean, the human, when we do some things or we, do something, I mean, we're proud of what we do. And it's kind of the way that we do and we're happy. But if we don't do it and other people do it, it means sometimes we're not really happy or we're not proud about it. Like you work in the community, why you demand the community to involve in for your design when you design their community. So the idea is to bring the community to proud what the idea contribute to your designs. But if you design by yourself and just show the plan to the community, is it they proud about your design or they like about your design? Sometimes they say like, okay, they like your design, but when you design it, they don't take care of it because they think it's not them to design it, or it's not the idea to do that. So the idea is it's hard to complete the answer of proud, because it kind of relate to desire and everything. But I think what the white building, in case white building that people build by their hands, or even they have small money for their children, they build by their hand, they're proud about it because they design it. Even they put the flower near the masonry, and they're proud that they can have flower because this flower they bought from the market. They put into like the vans, the pot by themselves, and they put that, and then they take care of it because they're proud, they're happy about that. But if you buy the flower for them and let them take care of it, I think they will not take care of it in the long run. I think because they think it's not involved in their they're thinking of the idea on that. And yeah, I don't have really specific answer for that too. So yeah.
So conclusion.
Ça va pas être des conclusions de toute façon.
It's not going to be a conclusion anyway. It's going to, because for us,
le fait de partager avec vous tous
the possibility of sharing our concerns will all view as more a starting point than a conclusion. So
d'autres rendez-vous.
There are going to be other events for publications. We're going to try and progress in defining what interests us in this between space, between blocks, which is not just simply a question of distance or measure between separate space, between separate objects thrown on the table by urbanists. We've seen some pictures today that are rather revelatory of what some urbanists imagine. But it's not just a physical issue, as Marianita has pointed out. There's a space-time where things become possible. So what are the things that become possible? For me, it's mainly one thing. And I'd almost like to quote a phrase by Olivier Rey, who was one of our keynote speakers yesterday. one of the sentences from his book, A Question of Size. He speaks at a certain moment, he talks about democracy. He says that democracy is when citizens actively participate in the life of the city and deal themselves with the things that concern them. The between space for us that's what it is. It is taking care of what concerns us individually. And that raises the question of the role of the state, the control of authority, the dominant force. And then it's the question of stopping thinking about this technical modernity, that everything must be taken over, and that citizens are children for whom systems need to be invented if they're going to be able to make progress in life. So between space for us, that's what it means. I'm not going to go any further because we will probably do it with the publication that will come in the future. Is there something you want to add? I wanted to say that this between space is between the project for these big spaces and the way that the inhabitants appropriate them. We're just not on the side of the inhabitants. And that's what Viviana reminded us yesterday. And for that, there is a phrase by Fiorentino, which is amazing, who therefore goes back to his own project. He found it very hard. And there's a legend that said he committed suicide because of that. It's not true, but that's the legend. In an interview, he visits Corviale in '93 with school children, and what he says is, we bet on the way on Corviale will be managed. In other words, that this experiment is both architecture and management, and like everything in the city, which are not simply made of facades, but also of organizations and services and transport, etc. So let's say that the political management of this house, that's what he called it, is the same or has the same weight or more weight than architectural management, as the little part that the architects reserve for their own project. If tomorrow's tenant thinks that he has a paternalist structure where everything is offered to him and where nothing is given to him, it is clear that Corviale is going to fail massively, because it is obvious that it's not made for paternalist-type management. If, on the other hand, the possibility opened by the very existence of shared spaces to create spaces for collective work, if that's exploited by the inhabitants, and therefore if Corviale is managed in a community manner, then it becomes important. That depends, of course, on a number of non-determinist considerations and a number of actions by the municipality on social workers, etc. I'm not sure that sentence, so I would like to thank... Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I can't remember what I want to say. On what Moderator said, we're not necessarily just on the side of the inhabitants. We're not on the side of every inhabitant. And what I want to say, as I saw it at, that everything becomes possible over time. This way of doing things individually or collectively is very fleeting often. And this between space often closes very quickly. And you need to look at that. You need to know what time frames these are going to operate with and how we are going to be able to study this phase, which it's often very difficult to identify our action if we don't take a great deal of distance. So that's what I think is important. It's not being close to the inhabitants that's important, it's being close to those who are trying to contradict certain processes that tend to be fatal, in particular for the future of the city, since we're talking about urban context. Okay, so thank you very much to all of you, for everybody. And now I'll pass the microphone to Marie-Hélène. And thank you very much to the City of Architecture, the technical team, and thank you to all. So the next meeting is tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock at Maffevon at Courneuve. The address is on the website. First, we'll begin by visiting Courneuve. We'll try and understand things with people who have worked there, who know the district. And in the afternoon, we'll go to La Villette at 2:30 p.m. for the final half day, which relates to the beginning of feedback on the French situation. And I hope we'll be able to pursue this question.